They came with guns, flags, and crosses. But Ethiopia had something older and stronger. Gods who walked with warriors. Spirits who wouldn't kneel. This isn't just history. It's the story of when divinity rose and colonizers fell. In a century defined by conquest, where European empires swallowed almost every inch of African soil, there was one land they couldn't touch. Not because it had the biggest army or the most advanced weapons, but because it had something empires couldn't understand: spirit. Ethiopia stood not just with swords, but with scriptures. Not just with generals, but with gods. It was a place where resistance wasn't just political, it was sacred. Across the mountains of Lalibela and the fields of Adwa, warriors marched beside priests, and every battle was fought on two fronts: the visible and the invisible. The cross wasn't just a symbol of faith, it was a shield of fire. The Ark of the Covenant wasn't just a relic, it was a living force carried into war. The Depteras, mystical priest warriors, didn't chant for ceremony. They chanted to awaken heaven. Ethiopia was not merely defending land, it was defending a covenant, a legacy of divine partnership. But was it just strategy? Was it brilliant terrain and clever politics? Or was there something more at work? Something that made bullets misfire and mountains tremble? Was Ethiopia protected by divine forces? Did its gods truly rise to fight beside its people? The flags of colonizers burned, yet Ethiopia remained. What shielded it? What power said no to empire and yes to freedom? This is the forgotten story of the gods who refused to bow, of the spirits who stood taller than any army. This is the story of a land that would not fall because its soul never surrendered. Ethiopia is not just a country. It is a sanctuary, an ancient citadel of divine heritage that stands at the intersection of history, prophecy, and sacred fire. Long before the modern nation-states of the West had drawn their borders or built their cathedrals, Ethiopia had already consecrated mountains, carved churches into stone, and preserved a spiritual lineage so potent that even empires feared it. It is home to one of the oldest Christian civilizations in the world, a faith unbroken since the 4th century, yet one that still pulses with the echoes of older, pre-Abrahamic deities that never fully left. Here, saints and spirits coexist. Psalms are sung alongside ancestral invocations, and the divine is not a theory, it is a force. At the heart of Ethiopia's spiritual identity lies a relic shrouded in mystery and reverence: the Ark of the Covenant. Believed by many to reside in the ancient city of Aksum, it is not kept in a museum but guarded in a monastery by a single chosen monk, never to leave or be seen by outside eyes. This ark is not myth. It is presence. It is said to emanate power, to anchor Ethiopia's soul, and to have walked onto the battlefield with emperors and kings. When Menelik III, son of the Queen of Sheba and King Solomon, is said to have brought the ark to Ethiopia, he brought with it not just a sacred object, but a cosmic pact. Surrounding this spiritual nucleus is a priesthood unlike any other, the Depteras. These are not simply monks or theologians. They are warrior mystics, spiritual tacticians trained in the ancient arts of scripture, healing, and supernatural defense. Armed with leather-bound holy books, talismans inscribed with Ge'ez invocations, and sacred incantations passed down through generations, Debteras do not merely serve in temples. They walk among the people. They chant at dawn to stir the spirits. They inscribe protection spells onto the walls of homes and the hearts of soldiers. In times of peace, they teach. In times of war, they rise. Ethiopia's spiritual worldview does not draw a line between the seen and unseen. It teaches that every physical war is preceded by a battle in the spirit realm, that every act of violence is seeded first in vibration, energy, and intent. Before soldiers march, priests fast. Before swords are drawn, psalms are read. Before the enemy is faced, the heavens are stirred. In this land, power is not limited to gunpowder or strategy. Power includes the utterance of sacred words, the sound of a drum echoing ancestral memory, the reading of a scroll older than the enemy's nation. This is why Ethiopia has never been fully conquered. Not because its soil is hard to cross, though its mountains are formidable. Not because its armies were always stronger, though they were fierce, but because its spirit is guarded by a covenant that transcends empire. Because here, resistance is rooted in faith. And faith is not a performance. It is a practice of real spiritual force. When colonizers came with their treaties and rifles, they encountered not just warriors, but a people whose lineage ran through saints and prophets. Ethiopians didn't just train soldiers, they prepared prophets. Young men learned not only the art of war, but the wisdom of scripture. Women held prayers as weapons. Elders spoke of visions and signs. The kingdom was not just armed, it was awakened. Ethiopia's sacred power is not a thing of the past. It is a living legacy, pulsing in its monasteries, encoded in its chants, whispered by its winds. The land remembers. The people remember. And in that remembering, the nation stands. Not just as a country, but as a covenant. A spiritual stronghold that refused to be broken. Because when your power is divine, no empire can erase you. As the 19th century wore on, Africa found itself in the crosshairs of European ambition. The so-called scramble for Africa was not a polite negotiation. It was a ravenous race, a global land grab masquerading as diplomacy. One by one, empires fell under the boots and banners of European powers. But Ethiopia, ancient and resolute, stood in the path of conquest. Italy, hungry for colonial glory and desperate to claim an African territory that could rival Britain's or France's, turned its gaze toward the Horn. What they saw was a kingdom they assumed to be primitive, disorganized, fractured, and easily deceived. But what they misjudged was that Ethiopia was not a land merely ruled by kings. It was a land governed by prophecy, defended not just by spears, but by spirit. In 1889, Italy attempted its signature maneuver, divide and conquer through diplomacy. They proposed a treaty, the Treaty of Uchali, which appeared on the surface to be a pact of friendship and mutual recognition. But what the Italians wrote in Italian was not what they wrote in Amharic. In the European vision, Ethiopia was reduced to an Italian protectorate, a vassal state, submissive, conquered by paper, not by war. But Emperor Menelik II, wise and spiritually guided, saw through the deception. He read between the lines, literally and cosmically. The treaty was a lie, and the lie was a declaration of war. But Menelik did not respond with haste. He did not rally his armies in anger alone. He called upon the heavens. Across the kingdom, churches echoed with the chants of fasting priests. Psalms filled the air like war drums. Holy water was poured, incense burned, and sacred relics were brought forth. The Debteras, those mystic guardians began invoking divine protection, drawing ancient symbols in ash and smoke, creating spiritual armor long before the physical battle began. The kingdom didn't just prepare for war, they sanctified it. The battlefield was not only earth, it was ether. As news of the Italian deception spread, the kingdom moved in unison. It wasn't just a political betrayal, it was a spiritual offense, a violation of trust, not just between nations, but between realms. The people knew that this was no ordinary conflict. It wasn't just a war of borders, it was a war of gods. The very sovereignty of Ethiopia's spiritual covenant was at stake. And so, from the highlands to the churches carved into mountains, the spiritual alarm was sounded. Menelik II was not merely a ruler, he was seen as a vessel of divine will. He understood that no army could withstand a force that moved with the power of the divine. Under his leadership, soldiers were not only armed with weapons, they were armed with blessings. Before marching, they received spiritual rites. They were anointed, prayed over, cleansed. Every step they took toward the coming war was a step guided by ancient power. Priests did not stay behind to pray from safety. They walked with the soldiers. They held crosses instead of swords. They chanted instead of shouted. But their presence was no less powerful. They reminded each warrior that he was not alone, that the ancestors marched beside him, that the land they defended was sacred ground, that to fight was not simply to survive, it was to protect a cosmic lineage. As Italy gathered its troops and prepared its cannons, Ethiopia gathered its spirit. It stood not as a scattered kingdom, but as a unified force of body and soul, of prophecy and preparation. And while European generals planned battles with maps and strategies, Ethiopia opened scrolls, lit candles, and looked to the heavens for guidance. This was not just resistance, it was remembrance. And in that remembrance, a storm was brewing, not just in the skies, but in the soul of a nation that refused to be enslaved. March 1st, 1896. The sun rose over the mountains of northern Ethiopia, casting a golden glow on the valley that would soon become sacred ground. On one side, the Italian army, armed with modern rifles, cannons, and the pride of European empire. On the other, the Ethiopian warriors, outnumbered, outgunned, and underestimated. But there was something the Italian generals could not see on their maps, something that couldn't be measured by the weight of their weapons or the size of their battalions. The Ethiopian forces did not march alone. They marched with ancestors, angels, and gods. Every warrior stepping into the field that day had been blessed. Holy water sprinkled on their foreheads, incense burning through the night, talismans tied to their necks, scriptures whispered into their ears. Before the sword was lifted, the spirit had been stirred. Depteras, those sacred mystics trained in both scripture and spirit, stood on the hills, chanting war psalms into the wind. Their voices carried across the valley, not just as sound, but as signal. They were summoning protection, calling down fire from the heavens, stirring the unseen to awaken and defend. In the heart of the camp, Emperor Menelik II knelt in prayer, not before his generals, but before the Ark of the Covenant itself. This was not a battle of ego or revenge. It was a moment of spiritual reckoning. Menelik understood what he was guarding. This wasn't just Ethiopian land. It was covenant land. Land that had hosted sacred relics, saints, prophets, and cosmic agreements. To surrender it would not only be a political defeat, it would be a spiritual collapse. And so he asked the divine not for victory, but for presence. That heaven would remember Ethiopia's faith and respond. And respond it did. The battle that unfolded defied every expectation. The Italians, confident in their technological advantage, moved in tight formations, expecting a quick rout. But what they encountered was not chaos. It was an orchestrated spiritual storm. Ethiopian warriors moved with precision and fury, their chants and cries echoing through the hills like thunder. And then, the sky itself shifted. Legend says that as the fighting intensified, the weather turned strange. Clouds gathered rapidly, casting a shadow over the battlefield. Some swore they saw lightning strike the ground near the Italian lines, though no storm had been forecast. Others claimed that a thick fog rose up unexpectedly, disorienting the invaders and breaking their formations. More than a few whispered of winged beings hovering above the battlefield, faces radiant with light, moving faster than the eye could follow. Italian reports from the day mentioned confusion, malfunctioning artillery, misfires, and breakdowns in communication, circumstances they attributed to bad luck. But to the Ethiopians, it was clear the gods had arrived. Taitu Betul, wife of Menelik, and a force in her own right, led a separate flank of warriors. She was no ceremonial figure. She was a strategist, a speaker of prophecy, and a battlefield commander. Her presence electrified the troops, her voice rallying the people not with fear, but with divine confidence. She reminded them that their bodies fought, yes, but their spirits were not alone. She stood as a symbol of the divine feminine in motion, an echo of the ancient queens, of the goddess energies of the land, of power that needed no permission to rise. Throughout the day, the Italians attempted to regroup. Their lines faltered under pressure, their weapons jammed, their soldiers panicked. They were met not by savagery, but by something they couldn't name, a sacred defiance, a rhythm of war that seemed to pulse from the earth itself. Every hill, every stone, every tree seemed to carry the memory of ancestors who had once defended this land. And now they had returned, not as spirits of the past, but as forces of the present. The Ethiopian forces didn't just win, they decimated the Italian army. Over 7,000 Italian soldiers were killed, with thousands more captured. It was the first major defeat of a European army by an African force in modern history. But the numbers tell only part of the story. What was truly shattered on that day was the illusion of European invincibility. Adwa cracked the spine of colonial arrogance. It sent a shockwave across Africa and the world. But for Ethiopia, it wasn't just a triumph, it was fulfillment. It wasn't just history, it was prophecy being fulfilled. Elders had spoken of a time when Ethiopia would face the fury of foreign empires. Prophets had warned of treaties that were traps, of strangers who came with crosses but carried chains. And they had also spoken of victory, not by might alone, but by remembering. Remembering who they were, remembering the spirits who stood with them, remembering that their strength came not from outside approval, but from internal alignment. Adwa became more than a military event. It became a symbol of spiritual resistance, a divine line in the sand. It reminded every colonized people that power is not always seen, that the invisible can be stronger than the visible, that prayer, fasting, ritual, and spirit are not passive acts, but weapons, when wielded with clarity and conviction. The aftermath was profound. Across Africa, leaders and rebels cited Ethiopia as proof that colonizers could be defeated, that African soil could still hold sovereignty, that black sovereignty was not a myth, it was memory. Rastafarians in Jamaica looked to Ethiopia as Zion, the promised land. Pan-African movements across the globe pointed to Adwa as evidence that the continent's story was not one of defeat, but of interruption, and that the story could be reclaimed. But most of all, Adwa left behind a sacred echo, one that still rings in the highlands and valleys, in the psalms of priests, and the chants of children. A memory that when gods rise, empires fall. When the spirit stands, no sword can cut it down. When people remember the power that walks with them, mountains move, bullets miss, and prophecy unfolds. This was not just a war, this was a ceremony of remembrance, and it ended with the divine undefeated. In the days and weeks following the Battle of Adwa, the European world was shaken. Newspapers in Italy tried to make sense of the defeat. Military analysts scrambled for explanations. How, they asked, could a modern European army with superior weaponry, logistics, and training be so thoroughly overwhelmed by an African kingdom? Some blamed miscommunication, others pointed to poor terrain strategy, but none of the answers could account for the unshakable will of the Ethiopian fighters. And certainly none could explain the strange, almost supernatural reports that emerged from the battlefield. To the colonizers, it was a failure of planning. But to Ethiopians, it was something else entirely. It was the gods. Among the people, stories began to spread like fire. Stories not born of myth, but of memory. Accounts of miracles, of visions, of events that defied logic. Warriors who should have died but rose again. Blades that moved with impossible speed. Forces seen on the battlefield that no eye could fully describe. Soldiers recounted seeing blinding lights in the sky, hearing voices in languages they didn't know, but somehow understood. Priests told of seeing Archangel Michael standing behind the Ethiopian line, his sword gleaming, his wings spread wide. Others swore Saint George rode through the storm, knocking enemy horses to the ground with a lance of fire. Yet even these celestial figures were not the only ones said to have appeared. Older gods, those from before the time of Christianity, were invoked in whispers, spirits of the land, guardians of the mountain passes, deities tied to rivers, thunder, and stone. Some said the very mountains came alive to protect their people. And in the oral stories passed from elder to child, from priest to congregation, there was a recurring thread. It was not only human strategy that won the day, it was the spirit. One tale speaks of a church nestled deep in the highlands, targeted by advancing Italian troops. As they approached, a thick fog descended without warning. Soldiers lost their way, stumbling into ravines, turning on each other in confusion. When the fog lifted, they were miles off course, the church untouched. Locals said an invisible wall had risen, a divine shield no bullet could penetrate. Another story tells of a priest who, days before the battle, had a dream. In it, he saw the path the Italian army would take and warned local commanders. When the attack came, Ethiopian forces were already in place, as if led by foresight itself. Perhaps most famous is the legend of the shaking mountain. During one of the critical clashes, a tremor rippled through the valley. The earth itself moved, not violently but deliberately. Italian forces, startled and disoriented, believed an earthquake had struck. But no structures fell, no rocks slid. Only the invaders seemed disturbed. Ethiopians say it was the land asserting its will. A living reminder that the soil itself was part of the resistance, that this wasn't just the people's war, it was the land's war, the ancestors' war, the spirit's war. Elders, asked about the victory, don't list battle formations or weapons. They speak of dreams and fasts. They speak of the prayers sung for months. They speak of angels, saints, and ancestral forces. Some say it was strategy. One elder is known to have said, "But we know it was the gods." And it wasn't said in metaphor, it was a literal truth. In Ethiopia, the spiritual and the physical are not two worlds, they are one. To fight is to pray, to defend is to invoke, and to win is not just to survive, but to prove that you walk in harmony with divine order. The victory at Adwa wasn't seen as a fluke or even a triumph of national pride. It was a validation that Ethiopia was still in alignment with its sacred protectors, still held within the covenant made by kings and prophets. The gods that held the mountains have not vanished. Their memory lives in every chant, every sermon, every story told at firesides and in Sunday masses. And in the highlands, where the battle once raged, people still walk with reverence. Not just for the history, but for the spirits who made history bend. In the years following Ethiopia's victory at Adwa, the global narrative began to take shape, but not in Ethiopia's favor. Western historians, scholars, and institutions quickly moved to frame the battle as an anomaly. They credited Menelik II's political intelligence, the ruggedness of Ethiopia's terrain, and the missteps of the Italian military. They wrote about diplomacy and military timing, about geography and logistics. But the spiritual foundation, the sacred fire that had fueled Ethiopia's resistance, was deliberately erased. The soul of the story was buried under footnotes and silence. This was no accident. The West, having built its empires on the claim of civilizing heathen lands, could not afford to acknowledge a spiritual system that had defeated them. Missionaries had long feared the power they encountered in Ethiopia. Here was a form of Christianity they could not control. It was older than their missions, deeper than their doctrine, and fused with elements they had long deemed heretical: mysticism, astrology, ancestral rites, and ancient African cosmologies. Ethiopian priests wore crosses, yes, but they also carried scrolls filled with secrets, invoked spirits beyond biblical canon, and sang in tongues not found in European churches. It was a Christianity that had not been colonized, and that made it dangerous. To the missionaries and colonial educators, Ethiopia's resistance was not just a military embarrassment, it was a theological crisis. It proved that black people didn't need European religion to be sacred, didn't need foreign hands to find God, and didn't need colonizers to define sovereignty. So the story was revised. The prayers were edited out, the visions dismissed as folklore. The battle was reduced to a clever act of politics, and the Ethiopian spirit was sidelined in favor of a more palatable, secular explanation. Textbooks never taught about the Debteras, who sang war psalms from the hills, or the fasting that rippled through the land before the battle. They did not mention the Ark of the Covenant or the warriors who carried amulets into combat. These weren't seen as strategic facts, they were spiritual ones. And the West had no language or no willingness to include the spiritual victories of Africa. So they buried them. Yet despite the erasure, Ethiopia's legacy refused to die. Across the black world, the story of Adwa whispered through generations. In Jamaica, Rastafarians crowned Ethiopia their Zion. In Harlem and Accra, pan-africanists invoked Ethiopia as the beacon of unbroken black sovereignty. The red, gold, and green of the Ethiopian flag became sacred colors of resistance, pride, and liberation. Ethiopia had not only remained unconquered, it had remained spiritually undefeated. It stood as proof that another way was possible, that Africa could guard its soul and still stand. Ethiopia became more than a country. It became a symbol, a code, a memory carried by those who had never set foot on its soil. In Ethiopia's survival, others found courage. In its spiritual defiance, others found their voice. Writers, prophets, revolutionaries, and artists all reached toward Ethiopia, not just as a nation, but as a prophecy fulfilled. It became the heartbeat of decolonial theology, the proof that faith could be both African and sovereign, both ancient and alive. The truth is, Ethiopia's greatest victory was not on the battlefield. It was in refusing to let go of its spirit, in refusing to allow missionaries to rewrite its sacred stories, in preserving its own path to the divine. even under pressure. And while the West tried to frame the country's independence as a geopolitical quirk, Ethiopia's people knew the deeper truth: they had been protected, not just by terrain or treaties, but by tradition, by spirit, by gods that never bowed. Ethiopia was not just unconquered, it was untouched by spiritual defeat. And that, more than any flag or throne, is its lasting legacy. A defiant flame that continues to burn, lighting the path for all those who seek to walk with dignity, memory, and divine power intact. Ethiopia did not survive because it was lucky. It survived because it remembered its gods. In an age where empires rose like storms and swallowed entire nations whole, Ethiopia stood still, unshaken, unbroken, undivided. Not because it had more men or stronger cannons, but because it had something the world could not quantify: spirit. The kind of spirit rooted not in superstition, but in sacred memory. In traditions that honored both saint and ancestor, both cross and soil, both heaven and earth. It fought with the power of history and the power of heaven. This was more than a military victory, it was a spiritual declaration. A sign to all who watched that when the spirit stands, no empire can win. That even in the face of invasion, erasure, and deceit, there is a force that cannot be colonized. The soul of a people who remember who they are. Ethiopia's survival is not a fluke, it is a flame. A living fire carried by prophets, queens, warriors, and priests who believed that no matter how strong the enemy seemed, the gods were stronger. So now we ask you, what are the sacred forces that you have forgotten? What ancestors still whisper through your blood? What truths do you carry that the world tried to bury? This isn't just Ethiopia's story, it is a mirror for all of us. A reminder that colonization is not just political, it is spiritual. And decolonization begins when memory is restored. If this awakened something in you, subscribe for more forbidden truths the textbooks won't tell. Comment below with the words, "The spirits still stand." Let us know which part of Ethiopia's divine resistance stirred your soul. And stay tuned for the next revelation. The African Eden was the garden of God in Ethiopia. Thank you for walking this journey. Thank you for listening not just with your ears, but with your spirit. In a world that forgets so easily, you chose to remember. And that in itself is resistance.